Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The smoke still lingered in the air, a suffocating reminder of the chaos that had unraveled. Prince Arthur stood in the shadows of the once vibrant city of Calidore, its streets now filled with the scent of burning wood and blood. His kingdom, his home, had become a battlefield, worse, a graveyard for dreams of unity and peace. The royal banners fluttered weakly in the wind, their deep red symbols now stained with soot and the betrayal of a brother. He had barely escaped with his life, the screams of his comrades still echoing in his ears. His mind replayed the moments of his brother Regan's symmetry, the smile Regan had flashed as he ordered the ambush, the flash of his blade that came so close to Arthur's neck. How had it come to this? Calidore had been a shining jewel, a city of warmth and prosperity. Now it was just another casualty in a war driven by ambition. Regan's hunger for power had turned the peaceful kingdom into a battleground pitting brother against brother, knight against knight. And in this devastation, Arthur found himself alone. His horse had been lost in the scramble, leaving him to flee on foot through the dense forests that surrounded the capital. He didn't really know where he was going, only that every step took him further from the palace and deeper into the unknown. The cries of his brother soldiers grew fainter as he stumbled through the woods, his heart heavy with the weight of his failure. Tired and wounded, Arthur reached the edge of an ancient ruin hidden beneath layers of moss and vine. He hadn't meant to find it. In fact, he barely registered its existence until he collapsed against the cold stone of its entrance, gasping for air. His chest heaved, pain searing through his body from wounds he hadn't yet tended. With shaking hands, he unsheathed his sword and set it down beside him, its once glistening blade dull from battle. For a long time, he lay there, the memories of the palace coup swirling in his mind like a dark storm. Regan's face haunted him, twisting in triumph as he declared himself the new king. But it was the betrayal that hurt the most, the betrayal of a brother who had once been his closest ally. Arthur's eyes closed, though. Sleep did not come. The ruin loomed behind him, an ancient place of forgotten history. He didn't care to know its origins, but as the hours passed and the shadows lengthened, something called to him from deep within its crumbling wall. At first, he ignored it, too tired and broken to care about anything other than surviving the night. But the call grew stronger, a whisper in the back of his mind, beckoning him deeper into the ruin. He rose slowly, his legs weak, his body aching with nothing left to lose. Arthur took a cautious step inside. The air was cooler here, almost suffocating in its stillness. His boots echoed on the stone floor as he moved further into the darkness, the light from the setting sun fading behind him. The whisper grew louder. Something ancient slumbered here, something powerful. And Arthur, in his desperation, followed the voice. He didn't know how long he walked, minutes, hours. It was all a blur. But soon he found himself standing before a large stone crypt, its surface carved with intricate designs that had long since worn away. And there, resting on a pedestal in the center of the room, was a sword. Its blade was black as night, its hilt adorned with dark rubies that seemed to glow in the faint light. Arthur hesitated, but the whisper, that irresistible call, urged him forward. His fingers brushed the hilt, and in that instant, he felt the sword's power surge through him. A coldness seeped into his bones, numbing the pain in his body, but with it came something else, a loss, a detachment from the emotions that had plagued him. He gripped the sword fully now, lifting it from the pedestal. It was light, yet its presence was immense, filling the room with an oppressive energy. As he held it, the voice in his mind became clearer. The sword introduced itself as Miyung, phantom, a weapon once wielded by kings to bend the wills of men. Arthur could feel its pull, the allure of control, of power, so intoxicating that he almost didn't care about the cost. Almost. But deep down, a small voice, the voice of the man he'd been before, Regan, South, betrayal, warned him. There would be consequences. Arthur ignored it. He left the ruin with phantom in hand, the darkness of the sword settling into his soul. He could feel it gnawing away at the edges of his emotion. The sorrow that had weighed so heavily on him moments ago felt distant, now as if it belonged to someone else. In its place was a cold resolve, a desire for vengeance that burned brighter than any love or loyalty he had ever known. As night fell, Arthur made his way toward a nearby village, one that had been loyal to his father. His heart no longer cared for the people, only for their usefulness. and that was when he first tested the sword's power. The village was small, its people simple and frightened. They had heard of the civil war that raged across the kingdom, but they had yet to see its devastation firsthand. Arthur approached the village leader, a stout man with tired eyes, and demanded his allegiance. The man refused. He spoke of loyalty to the crown, of the danger that came with choosing sides. Arthur felt nothing but contempt as he drew Phantom from its sheath. The sword's sense, power surged through him once more, and the village leader's resistance crumbled. His eyes glazed over, and he fell to his knees, swearing fealty to Arthur without another word. It was easy, too easy. The villagers followed their leader Sen's example, and soon Arthur had his first loyal soldier. They were untrained and untested, but they would serve their purpose. He left the village the next morning with a small band of men at his back, their minds twisted by Phantom's influence. As they marched, more joined his cause. Each village, each town he passed through fell under the sword's spell. Arthur's army grew, and with it, his power. But with each swing of Phantom, with each act of manipulation, he could feel himself slipping further away from the man he had once been. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. His brother sat on the throne, and Arthur would stop at nothing to reclaim what was rightfully his, even if it meant losing himself in the process. Weeks passed, and Arthur's army swelled to hundreds. They moved through the kingdom like a storm, crushing any who stood in their way. But as his influence spread, so did the whispers of his growing cruelty. Sir Gawain, a knight who had once served his father, joined Arthur's forces after hearing of his rebellion. She had fought alongside him before Regan's betrayal, and though she was loyal, she noticed the change in him almost immediately. At first, she chalked it up to the horrors of war. They had all lost something in the Chaos Friends family, their sense of home. But as the weeks dragged on, Sir Gawain began to see the true cost of Phantom's power. Arthur was no longer the compassionate prince she had sworn to follow. He was colder, now more distant. The look in his eyes when he gave orders chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just the way he led, but the way he fought. Arthur no longer cared for the lives of his men. He sent them into battle without a second thought, willing to sacrifice anyone if it meant achieving his goal. He used Phantom's power without restraint, bending the minds of enemy commanders to turn on their own forces, creating chaos wherever he went. And with each victory, he grew more ruthless. One night, after a particularly bloody battle, Sir Gawain confronted Arthur in his tent. She stood at attention, her armor still splattered with the blood of the men they had lost, but her voice was steady. "We need to talk, Arthur." "We need to talk." Arthur glanced up from the maps spread across the table, his fingers still idly tracing the edge of Phantom's hilt. The glow from the fire outside cast long, flickering shadows in the tent, but his expression remained hard, unreadable. Sir Gawain stepped forward, her jaw set in determination. "Tari, this isn't the way to win back the kingdom. What you did today, those men you sent to die, they trusted you." Arthur's gaze flicked to her, cold and distant. "Uri, they were necessary sacrifices. They were people. Arthur, your people." He stood slowly, letting the sword dangle loosely in his hand. His eyes were sharp, like chips of ice, and there was something unnerving about the calmness in his voice. When he spoke, "People will always die in war. This isn't a child's game, Gwen. You know that as well as I do." She shook her head, disbelief etched on her face. "I thought you were different. I thought you cared about something more than just vengeance." Arthur let out a low, humorless laugh, and the sound of it sent a shiver down her spine. "All vengeance is all I have left." She took a step back, her hand resting on the hilt of her own sword, though she didn't draw it. "Stirring what happened to you, the Arthur I knew would have never. The Arthur you knew is gone." He cut her off sharply, stepping closer until the dim light from the fire caught the dark gleam of Phantom. "Regan took everything from me, my family, my future, my kingdom. Do you really expect me to show mercy, to play the role of the noble prince while he sits on my throne?" Gwen held his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Story, but at what cost, Arthur? Look at what you're becoming. This sword, this thing you were carrying, it's twisting you." Arthur's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Phantom is only a tool, Gwen, a tool to reclaim what is mine. But it's changing you." She insisted, creeping into her voice. "Every time you use it, you lose a part of yourself. I can see it. You're not the same man you were when we started this. He said nothing for a long moment, just stared at her with those cold, distant eyes. Then he turned away, his grip tightening on the sword. Harry, leave. Gwen, get some rest. We have a battle to fight tomorrow. She opened her mouth to protest, to say something, anything that might bring him back from the edge he was standing on. But the words caught in her throat. There was nothing left to say. The Arthur she had once known was gone, swallowed by the darkness of phantom. Without another word, she turned and left the tent, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just witnessed. As the flap of the tent closed behind her, Arthur stood alone, staring down at the sword in his hand. The blade seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight, as if it were alive, feeding on the emotions he no longer felt. There was a part of him that knew Gwen was right, that knew he was losing something with every swing of the sword, every mind he bent to his will. But that part of him was growing smaller with each passing day, each passing battle. He didn't care, not anymore. The next morning, Arthur's army marched on Hollowford, one of the last strongholds of Regan's forces. The city was heavily fortified, its walls tall and impenetrable, its gates guarded by hundreds of soldiers loyal to the false king. But Arthur knew it wouldn't last, not against the power of phantom. As they approached the city, Arthur's generals gathered around him, offering strategies and plans for breaching the wall. But Arthur had no interest in tactics. He had phantom, and with it, he would tear Hollowford apart from the inside. That night, as the moon rose high over the battlefield, Arthur stood at the edge of his camp, staring at the distant silhouette of the city. The fires from his army flickered in the darkness, but all he could think about was the sword in his hand, the power it promised. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to use it, to bend the will of his enemies until they bowed before him. With a deep breath, he raised Phantom toward the city, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. The air around him grew thick, and he felt the familiar surge of power coursing through him as the sword's magic reached out across the battlefield. In his mind, he could see the soldiers inside the city Regan, sun and tired and weary, their morale low after months of fighting. One by one, their thoughts became his. One by one, they fell under his control. It was easier now, easier than it had ever been. The sword's sent power flowed through him effortlessly, bending the minds of the enemy commanders with just a thought. He could feel their fear, their hesitation, their doubt, and with a single command, he turned them against each other. The battle was over before it began. Arthur's forces marched into Hollowford unopposed, the city-state swinging open, as Regan's men tore each other apart from within. By the time Arthur stepped through the gates, the streets were littered with the bodies of those who had once sworn loyalty to his brother. Sir Gwen followed behind him, her face pale as she took in the carnage. This wasn't a battle, this was a massacre. Arthur walked through the streets with Phantom in hand, his eyes cold and empty as he made his way toward the castle at the heart of the city. He didn't care about the lives lost, didn't he care about the destruction left in his wake. All that mattered was the throne and the man who sat on it. When he reached the castle, Regan was waiting for him in the throne room. The man who had once been his brother now looked gaunt, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "So it's come to this," Regan said, his voice trembling slightly as he rose from the throne. Arthur said nothing, only stared at him with those cold, empty eyes in his hand. Phantom pulsed, eager for blood. Regan drew his sword, though. It was clear he knew the battle was already lost. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. "I never wanted it to end like this." Arthur stepped forward, his grip tightening on Phantom's hilt. "You took everything from me," he said, his voice low and filled with a quiet fury. "My family, my kingdom. You deserve nothing less than death." Regan's eyes flickered with a brief flash of regret, but it was too late for apology. Arthur raised Phantom, the sword, stark power surging through him as he prepared to strike the final blow. But in that moment, as he stood over his brother, something inside him hesitated. For just a brief moment, he remembered who he'd been before all of this. He remembered the brother he had once loved, the man who had stood by his side through their childhood. He remembered the dreams they had shared, the promises they had made to each other. And then, as quickly as the memory came, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the sword. With a single swing, Arthur ended Regan's life. The sound of the blade cutting through flesh echoed in the silence of the throne room, and as Regan's body crumpled to the ground, Arthur felt nothing. There was no triumph, no satisfaction in his victory, only a cold, hollow emptiness. He stood there for a long moment, staring down at his brother, his lifeless body, phantoms still gleaming in his hand. The sword had given him everything he needed to reclaim his throne, but in doing so, it had taken everything from him. Slowly, he turned and sat on the throne, the weight of the crown heavy on his head. Outside, his army cheered, celebrating the end of the Civil War, the restoration of the rightful king, but Arthur didn't hear them. He didn't feel anything at all. Phantom, its purpose fulfilled, vanished from his hand, leaving only the cold, empty throne behind. Arthur stared out at the shattered remnants of his kingdom, the kingdom he had fought so hard to reclaim. But as he sat there alone in the throne room, he realized that in the end, it wasn't to the kingdom that had been broken. It was him.